Hey guys, welcome back to LongtinArt. This is Dan Longton. Today we're going to be talking about a drawing technique called perspective. We're going to be discussing a little bit of the different kinds of perspective, like isometric versus perspective projection. We're not going to get into the more advanced distorted perspective as axonometric or obliques, but we are going to be focusing on two different types of perspective, and one is the one that we actually really focus on the most, especially in observational drawing or painting, is going to be perspective projection, not isometric. And I've seen a lot of things from students, and I see them currently, I see them in the past, and I know I'm going to see them again in the future. So I wanted to make a video about perspectives and the difference between the two, because as we grow up as children, we usually draw in the isometric perspective because it does convey a sense of depth and space, and you can overlap and you can change size and give a sense of depth in a flat two-dimensional surface and give the illusion of three-dimensionality. But most of the time, isometric doesn't work. And if you've ever played any video games like, I think World of Warcraft is in an isometric perspective. I think if you've ever played the game Sims, I know I'm showing my age now, and these are isometric perspectives because it shows everything, and it works good for video games because the distortion doesn't have to take place. So you can have a character walking around without getting smaller. And what I mean by that, and the difference between isometric perspective and perspective projection, let me show you an image here real quick. So the difference between the two of these, the top one is perspective projection, and the bottom is isometric perspective. Now on the top, on the top cube, this is really how we see the world around us. And you can see that there are two vanishing points onto the horizon. You can see how those kind of lighter lines converge to a single point on the horizon line on both sides. So there's 2 points on the horizon line, which is indicated by that dashed line in the back. Now, this makes sense because when we look at it, obviously, if we were standing, next to a building and the building was like, 500, feet long, it's going to appear smaller the further away it gets from us, from our vantage point, meaning where we're standing. And as it goes into the space and towards the horizon line, what is parallel, meaning the corner edge of where, like in the middle of that top where that kind of looks like a Y, buildings don't get smaller as they go, further down the horizon. It's the ceiling is 10 feet and it goes all the way down. But to us, when we stand next to it, it looks as though it gets smaller. And what I mean by that, and you might have seen, in a building, like an educational building or something along the lines, that, you have these tiles on the ground and tiles on the ceiling. And that when you look up at the ceiling, they're square and they're all the same size, but as they recede into space, they appear to get smaller and smaller. And you can see that in this image here. And that is what isometric perspective does not do. Isometric perspective keeps everything the same size. So when we look at, something like the cube on the bottom here, everything stays parallel. So the bottom lines going off to the right next to that 30-degree angle is parallel to the line above it, which is also parallel to the line in the upper left in the back of the cube. All of these lines are parallel and they go off into space and are parallel forever. They never converge. Whereas on the top, which is what what perspective projection does, is it conveys this sense of scale getting smaller the further and further away an object gets. And that's exactly what's going on in this image here. Is that as we look at the tiles on the ceiling, they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller the further away from the viewpoint, which is the vanishing, not to be confused with the vanishing point, but the vantage point from where we're standing. Now, if we were to take a step to the left or a step to the right, all of these lines would change and all of the angles would change, but it's still the kind of the same approach. So you have to be very careful when you're drawing perspective as to where you start drawing or painting, because as you shift to one way or the other, all of those lines, like on the ceiling tiles, they're all going to shift because they're based on where you're standing, your vantage point. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about today in the difference between 1 point, 2 point. We won't really get into 3 point just yet, but today I just wanted to give a quick introduction about 1 point versus 2 point, because I've seen in grading in my students' work is that for some reason it's really hard to get beyond the isometric perspective that we grow up drawing. And I'm going to draw you guys behind me. I've got my drawing board set up behind me. You can see. I'm gonna draw like a barn at first to show you what isometric does. So let's go ahead and get started here. So let's talk about the differences between isometric versus perspective projection. Now, as we grew up, we started drawing, barns and things in the isometric perspective, except that these lines never converge when we start to think about isometric versus perspective projection. Now, how we see the world around us is going to be in a couple of different types of perspective projections. And this is an accurate way of how we see the world around us. Now, the first one is a little bit limiting. We've already done this, and it's 1 point perspective. Now, I just drew a horizon line with 1 point on it, hence the name 1 point perspective. And there's a couple of rules that we discussed, which was vertical lines remain vertical, and the horizontal lines remain horizontal. So there's 2 rules here. And once you do that, any square or building, the plane that's facing us is going to get vertical and horizontal lines to create the cube. Now, if this was a building, I could very easily turn this into a gas station or something. But the verticals are vertical and the horizontals are horizontal. And I can do this anywhere on the page as long as my orthogonal lines, which are those lines of convergence, those angled lines that go towards the perspective, meet at that 1 point. Now, with 2 point perspective, I'm using the same horizon line, and it's always at eye level, guys. It's always at eye level, no matter if we're on the 26th floor or the 1st floor or at street level. There's only one rule with 2 point perspective, is the verticals are always vertical. So I'm going to kind of split the page here, and I'm going to add 2 points this time on the horizon line. I'm going to add my verticals, and then I'm going to kind of cut the cube where it needs to be to create the illusion of a 3-dimensional cube. These lines, depending upon which plane I'm looking at, converge. These orthogonal lines converge to both points because now the convergence is going both right and left. And you can see how that effect is achieved with 2 vanishing points. Only verticals remain vertical. That is the one rule in 2 point perspective. So as you can see, there are some limitations that isometric perspective doesn't allow. I mean, the reason why most gaming companies use isometric perspective is because they don't have to program the distortion of something getting smaller as it recedes into the space of a 2-dimensional surface. I mean, it doesn't actually get smaller in reality. In the real world, like as we walk down a hall, people appear to get smaller as they get further and further away. But in a game, that's complicated code that the engineers have to write for it to appear to get smaller. It's really just changing scale as it goes down the page. And this is why, games like Sims or I believe Minecraft and World of War, I believe use these. I could be wrong, but that's on the games. But that's why Sims definitely uses that, because it works in a tile system. They just write the code once and repeat the code so that it can be applied to any level or any sort of room or anything like that. But while it does convey a sense of depth, it doesn't exactly convey an accurate sense of how we view the world around us. And this is why it's important to understand perspective projection when you're drawing from observation, especially like when you're drawing a hallway or a building or a room or anything in real life, because even trees become perspective because, I mean, if you're out in a field and it's full of oak trees really don't get much bigger than what they're supposed to get. They have a limitation to 30, 40 feet. There's going to be some variance, but I mean, if they're in a row like in an orchard, they're going to grow about the same rate and at the same time that they were planted. They're going to be playing on perspective as well. So 1-point perspective, again, just to bounce to relay, there's certain rules in 1-point perspective versus 2-point perspective. Now we can get on to 3-point perspective, but I'm not going to talk about that today. The rules of 1-point perspective are simple. Because you are parallel to the plane that is not receding in space, meaning your chest is parallel to the side of the building and it's receding out in one direction. And I'm going to draw a 2-point perspective problem here in a second. When you're parallel in 1-point perspective, the verticals and horizontal lines are always going to be parallel. And you saw that when I started drawing cubes. And the cubes are not just an exercise. These could be buildings. This is the basic shape of a building is a square, a cube. So you start off with a cube and change it into a house, a building, and you add more cubes, and now all of a sudden it's a skyscraper. So the horizontal lines and the vertical lines will remain vertical always in 1-point perspective. That is a very limited approach on distortion because it's like standing on a sidewalk and looking straight down, or on a railroad track and looking straight down. I believe I included a YouTube video from another YouTube user that even drew out a railroad track and talked about standing on a railroad track and as they get smaller and smaller. And that's 1-point perspective. 2-point perspective, there's only one rule, is that the verticals remain vertical because those orthogonal lines will go off and recede into the vanishing points on the horizon line. The key is that the vanishing points are always on the horizon line, which the horizon line is always at high level. So even if you're in a skyscraper on the 23rd, 30th, 50th floor, the horizon line is at your eye level. Versus someone that's down at street level at the exact same time, the horizon level to them is at eye level. And it changes. This is why it's so important to not move when you start drawing from observation. And the thing about working from a photograph is that it flattens the image. There's a lot more depth to be seen because the camera flattens it naturally and puts it on a two-dimensional surface. So you get more information when you're drawing from observation as opposed to drawing from real life. You get more information from drawing from observation as opposed to drawing from a photograph, which flattens the image. And it does change the look a little bit. It does. You can tell who's working from a photograph and who's working from observation. But the real rule is that those orthogonal lines have to go to a point. So I'm going to do a quick demonstration on how to draw a 2-point perspective. This next little drawing is going to be of a building. Let me show you the image here real quick. So I just pulled off an image off the internet, and I'm going to show you guys this one right here. Oh, wrong one. That's 1-point perspective. Here is a 2-point perspective problem. Because the plane is not facing us, meaning the wall on the left with the large, tall window, that is not facing us. It's actually facing to the left of us. We're actually facing the corner of the building. So the convergence goes both to the left and to the right. And I'm going to show you that here in just a second. So the first thing that you want to do is gauge where your corner is. And I'm going to find the corner by looking at my reference, which it's not quite centered in the image. It's off to the left a little bit. And then find your horizon line. In this case, it's kind of low. It's about in the middle of the windows, which is what I'm putting here. And then add your vanishing points, which is going to be on the far left and the far right, which is that first dot right there and the second dot. Now, it's going to be off the page a little bit because it doesn't quite fit. But as long as you're close to the edge of the page, it's going to work just fine. And then from there, anything that is on the plane going to the right, is going to go to the right vanishing point, and on the flip side of that, anything that's on the left is going to be going to the left. Now, what I'm doing there is just adding a little X inside my cube to find the center in my square there, to find the center where that rooftop meets, because it does. It's an A-frame house, so it's kind of right there in the center. And then from there, you're drawing your vertical lines, and trying to getting a little box going from where certain points are. I know my reference kind of blocks that right there, but you can see that I'm just kind of getting those windows on the second floor kind of blocked in. And I'm not going to go into super detail with this drawing. I'm just trying to show you guys how quickly this thing can come together. So going from that vanishing point, I'm going to draw the top of the windows. It's like just a little correction there, because it looks like, nope, that's not the spot. That's that bottom one. So we went to the second one. It looks like I forgot that I had already made it a vanishing point. So that little enclave, that little outcropping of the window there, that part that goes to the left goes to that thing right there. It goes to the left vanishing point. Top of the roof goes to the right vanishing point. There's a little bit of a roof indicator right there on the back. And you'll notice that I am not using a ruler, because it becomes a little bit mechanical when you start using a ruler. I typically, only for this demo, am I drawing really, really heavily, and giving my lines a little bit darker just so it shows up on camera. But when you start drawing with a pencil, and especially like a mechanical pencil and a ruler, it starts to look like architectural drawing. And, there's a place for that if you're, you want to study architecture and drafting, and a very mechanical type of approach. There's a place for that if you're interested in that. It's a very controlled and very systemized system. It's a very systemized level of drawing, in the sense that, there's no question as to where things are. Architectural drawing should be very much in the sense that, an outlet goes where a wall is, and, a sink goes there. And, there shouldn't be any question as to the contractor as where things are. So that's why they're so mechanical, because, we don't want sketches when we're building a house. Otherwise, it would kind of take a long time to build a house. So I'm not using a ruler, just to show you that it can be done relatively quickly. With very little effort. I think I did this in about 15 minutes, and for the sake of this video, I cut it down to half, so it's about 7 minutes of this little sketch that I'm doing. And I don't go into detail. I allow you guys to go into detail, but I could very easily draw the reflections on the glass, each line of those panels on the siding, the reflections on the glass, the objects inside the house, the tree, the shrubs behind the house, that little table and patio chair there, the ferns on the patio outside the glass window there, and the trees in the right side, and that secondary building in the back. Absolutely, I could go into the detail, but this is just mainly for you guys to see the level of the system. And it looks a little angled just because of the angle of the camera, but you really want to make sure that your vertical lines are vertical. You don't really want them to be angled and kind of, kind of wonky, because then you start to get in what kind of looks like a funhouse type of scenario, where walls aren't typically vertical, and it can kind of, you'll notice it. And the easiest way is to compare the edge of the page to the edge of your line, your line to the edge of the page. And you can see mine's a little bit off there, but I think I corrected at the end of the video. You can see my edge of my my building on the right side is a little bit angled, but it's not too bad. I think it's really just that kitchen area that pops out. I think I'm just starting to get an indication of where paneling should start to go. And there is a system to see, where these panels, you can get a systemized way of doing it, and I just don't really want to go into that right now. Really what I'm doing is I'm just counting panels and kind of eyeballing where they are. just to kind of give me an indication of where they should go. And now I'm just moving over to the other side. So it looks like that window's right about the same level of the edge of the roof, so I'm using that same line. And then I'm adding my edge. And it's that little enclave is going to go, that little outcropping is going to go to the other point, and now I'm going back to the other one, and there's that edge, that little new cube coming out of the side of the building. And it looks like the peak of the building is right there at the side of that window, so I use that middle line to kind of indicate where the edge of that building, of the little window cube should be. And now I'm going to move up to that second one up on the second floor, or it looks like a 1.5 floor, something like a little smaller window up there. So it actually breaks the roof there, so that's why I'm erasing that. So little base of the base of it, that looks a little close. What I'm going to do here, yeah, that's going to be a little bit too close to that second point, so I'm going to erase that, and that's a little too close. There's a little bit more space in there in the image, so I'm going to erase that and move those lines over just a little bit. Using the history of what's already on the page, I'm actually just going to move it over just a little bit, give a little bit more space between those windows and the wall, and then start adding my vertical lines. Add the top of the window, and then the receding plane to the other vanishing point, and now I've got my cube protruding out of the wall. So you can see it's not that difficult if you follow the system. And I know my demo is there's a reference image kind of covering things here, but you'll get the idea. I'll take that off here in a second. Just kind of bumping up the lines, because now I'm committed to these things and just doing it really quick. So again, I do expect you to have a level of detail in your building, like I did in mine. I'm not in the demo going to go all the way into this, because this is a demonstration. And once you get things in place, like windows and the structure of the building itself, then it's just the fun starts. The fun part begins with value and shade, and you can see how the light is a little bit different on the top of the paneling on the left side, and how the light's darker on the bottom because it's reflecting trees off to the distance and the other buildings. And that's pretty much it, guys. I mean, I'm just adding a little bit of a reference to a patio here. But that's pretty much the structure and the blocked in form. And there's a little bit of an indication of a tree that I could go into. I'm not going to go into detail with that, but you get the idea. So I'm going to remove the image here. Okay, guys. Well, that was the demonstration of 2-point perspective. The real rule of thumb is that on that last slide before I started talking, is that, you really want to make sure that your planes are facing the correct vanishing point at all times. And if you stick to the rules, it's a pretty easy system to follow. And if you struggled with 1-point perspective, you really need to make sure that you look at those images online, Google search 1-point perspective, and make sure you understand that orthogonals lead to the vanishing point. Because if you don't, it's really not going to make sense in 2-point perspective, because now you're dealing with the intersection of orthogonal lines to create an effect, and it's really going to confuse you. So again, if you have any questions, send me an email. Thanks for watching.